Okay. All right. Well, I'm here to, so first of all, I'm Ryan Taylor. I'm the CEO of Dash Core Group, and I'm here to, present on store of value and how we, as the Dash network, can improve our attributes as a store of value. And we'll get into more about what that means. But I want to start by recognizing what we're really good at. Dash is the best payments network in the industry right now. We have instant transactions, very low costs, not only instant transactions, but instant settlement of those transactions that you can respend immediately. We have a strong governance framework, one that is decentralized in nature, yet provides self-funding to the entities that serve the network. We've developed very professional teams. We have governance that exists in the real world in the form of the Dash Trusts and the Dash Investment Foundation that are able to interact with the real world. We've built the first network that's basically immune to 51% attacks. So we're this incredibly reliable payment network that works, and it works as expected for our users. And so the result has been pretty astounding. We've got one of the fastest growing networks in terms of usage. When you look at our usage metrics and compare them against other similar coins like Litecoin, Bitcoin Cash, and Bitcoin, we're growing those transactions at a faster rate. When you look at active wallets, our active wallets are increasing every single quarter. We're acquiring new users. We're solving real world problems. And Chainlocks has been a big accelerator for us. We introduced this technology earlier this year. It's been adopted by exchanges. It's been an enabler for instantly respendable transactions. And before we introduced Chainlocks, like all blockchains, there were block reorganizations that occurred from time to time. Things weren't truly settled until you had a large number of confirmations on your blockchain. And that really causes user issues. You have to wait in order for a transaction to really be considered final. Now, we had instant send locks occurring here that would prevent individual transactions from reverting. But Chainlocks has done something really unique. After we introduced Chainlocks, which is right about this date, you can see that block reorganizations effectively go away. Miners know that they have absolutely no incentive to even attempt one. And so we have, at this point, a very secure network, one that functions incredibly well for payments. And it begs the question, we're growing transactions at such an incredible rate. This is the mean number of economic transactions on our network. And you can see we've nearly tripled the number of transactions over a 1-year period. This is incredible growth. And it accelerated when we introduced Chainlocks. And so people are using our network. If you look at active wallets, it's a very similar pattern to this. And so in parallel, though, our price has been suffering. How do you reconcile these two things? At some point, the growth has got to start to have an impact on price, doesn't it? Well, I believe that Dash's economics that are built into the network actually cause destabilization of our price. And I'll walk through in detail each of these areas and kind of explain why. Like many cryptocurrency projects that were introduced in the 2014 timeframe, we mimicked Bitcoin's emission schedule. It's a declining schedule. Every year, the number of coins being emitted by the network, new coins in circulation, continues to drop. That is an attribute that virtually all cryptocurrencies have, and particularly from the time that Dash was launched. We uniquely have masternode collateral. Masternode collateral was a concept that we introduced. We're the first to introduce this to the market. In order to upgrade your full node to a masternode, you need to prove ownership over 1,000 Dash. And that creates some unique attributes of our network that many other networks don't have. And there was good reason for it. We need the masternode layer of the network to be what's called Sybil-proof. No one person should be able to control it. And the only way to prevent that is to require them to acquire assets in order to do it. And so this was a mechanism that solved that problem. But it did introduce some other attributes to our network, and we'll get into those. ASIC-based proof of work mining. So there are unique economics associated with miners, and I'll get into the details on that a bit later, that cause miners to increase supply to the network when demand is highest, or when demand is lowest for the coin, and to do the opposite. When demand is high, they actually reduce supply, and I'll explain why. That has a destabilizing effect. We also have, pretty uniquely, a block reward allocation that is not 100% to miners. We allocate a portion towards masternodes in order to incentivize them to create masternodes and operate them and prove that they're providing services to the network. And so that is an incentive system that we put in place, but it again sets Dash apart. And the last thing is investor sentiment. That really does go into long-term price instability as well. If you are outperforming the market over a long period of time, it increases confidence. And increased confidence leads to more people acquiring the coin. And if the price is going down, of course, the opposite occurs. And so as these things feed into price stability, investor sentiment is kind of a second order result that can occur. Before we get into the details of those things, it's helpful to have a little bit of historical background on Dash. Back in 2014, April of 2014, is when Evan first introduced the concept. Evan Duffield, the founder of Dash, introduced the concept of a masternode. There weren't a lot of details available on it at first. Very few people that were aware of the project. But he started to introduce these concepts over the next couple of weeks, educating people about what collateral would be required and things of that nature. And lo and behold, the price started to increase. And it started to increase pretty dramatically. That drew a lot of attention on the project. And you can see what happened. The price went from well under $1 to $15 in a matter of a few weeks. It was incredible. And the price started to crash right here. The reason for that was that there was a fork in the blockchain. It was very unstable. There was a new release, and it caused a bit of a panic. The price started to fall. A fix was introduced, and Evan, at the same time, announced that the masternode allocation would actually be 20%. This immediately reversed the declining price. And when I first met Evan in August of 2014, we talked about this event. And we also talked about what his intentions were with masternodes. He expressed that he felt like he might have wanted to introduce 50%. And what I told him is, I'm really glad you didn't, because if you think 20% caused a spike, 50% would have been really disastrous for the long term of this project. And the reason is because if you calculate the ROI that the number of masternodes being created implied, masternodes were demanding in order to lock up their collateral, and figured out how many coins were in circulation. There weren't enough coins in circulation to accommodate a 50% allocation towards masternodes. The theoretical price of a masternode would have gone to infinity. Of course, it wouldn't have, because there were a limited number of people with access to limited amounts of resources that were available to buy collateral. And when we talked about the future and what his plans were, he wanted to introduce instant send. He wanted to introduce a governance system. And in order for those things to function and function well, he needed a larger number of masternodes. And so I counseled him that you want to do that slowly over time. If you're going to increase the allocation towards masternodes in order to encourage more of them, you need to do it slowly. And so that's exactly what he did. The initial allocation was 10% and went to 20%. Starting in October, he put in an automated increase on a month-to-month basis that slowly increased the allocation towards masternodes. Now, this is a very delicate process. There was a lot of math that went into this. I had actually suggested a slower increase initially. He went with a little bit of a faster one, and then you can see it basically was increasing at about 2.5% increase in allocation to the masternodes. Now, there were two intents behind this. One was to increase the number of masternodes over time, and then, of course, avoid any types of spikes or rapid declines in price. And so it was a very delicate process. It was pretty successful. Throughout this time, things remained very stable on a relative basis. And then he reached the point where not only instant send was completed, but the proposal system was up and running. And the theory was that if you get this proposal system up and running, that should provide some fuel for growth and to provide for teams that are helping to build the network and so on. And this was, our strategic advantage, and it remains an incredible asset to the project today. Interestingly, the number was slated to go as high as 60% allocation to masternodes. Go back, look at the code. It was supposed to go as high as 60%. And it just so happened that he finished the proposal system earlier than expected and put it into operation. And so we ended up with 45, 45, 10 as our split between masternodes, miners, and proposal system, a little bit based on the timing of that event. The other thing that was happening, Evan actually wanted 20% to go towards the proposal system, but this was really new. Nobody knew if it would work well. Nobody knew if it would have the intended effect. And many masternode owners were reluctant to see a portion of what they viewed as their reward system to go towards these common enterprise type of activities that would benefit the whole network. And so that was kind of the compromise. We'll put this in place. It will be around 10%. When you back out a little bit and look at all the coins in circulation, what I've done here is across the top bar, I've put the circulating supply. This is supply not locked up in masternodes. And on the bottom is the collateral that is locked up away from circulating supply by the masternode system. And you can see in the early days here, as the allocation was increasing, so was the number of masternodes. And you can see that that acceleration really slowed down after the 45% was set. It seemed like we'd accomplished kind of the goal of increasing the number of masternodes without causing any type of major issues. There were a couple changes that occurred after that point, though. One is ASIC miners were released. Why is this important? Well, ASIC miners are far more efficient at producing hash rate. And Dash, at this point in time, had a variable emission schedule. It depended on the hash rate. If hash rate was low, it would encourage more miners by increasing the block reward size. And if the number of the amount of hash rate increased, the block reward size would go down. And what happened here is that with the invention of ASIC miners, the number of block, or the amount of coins being produced, floored down to the bottom. And so what ended up happening here is the emission of new coins dropped suddenly. At the same time, the ROI of masternodes started to go down. Perhaps the market viewed Dash as a less risky project. The proposal system was very innovative. It was proving to be effective. The risks associated with the project were dropping, and that caused an accumulation of additional masternodes. And then we have what I believe was a big triggering event. For those of you that were at the last open house, you'll remember that Evan announced in March of 2017 that he had taken his masternodes down. He'd been receiving a lot of criticism from the community about the number of masternodes he might be operating. There was a lot of criticisms that he had an undue influence on the proposal system itself, voting on his own proposals. And I think he made the decision that he shouldn't be operating masternodes. Perhaps that's a conflict of interest. And so he announced at that event that he had taken his 265 masternodes down. And I've indicated that in yellow. What that did is it moved 265,000 Dash from the masternode collateral back into circulating coins. But they didn't actually enter circulation. This doesn't mean he went out and sold everything. What it means is he shut his masternodes down. And so what actually happened during this quarter, Q1? Well, not only were those 265 masternodes made up for, the total of another 210 or so that were created, a total of 475 masternodes spun up to not only replace his, but grow the masternode network. 475,000 coins. That was a huge portion of the supply that was bought on the open market. And we know they were bought on the open market because there was a large seller back here in 2016. At one point, there was one owner who had somewhere around 600 masternodes. And they had been selling them in large chunks to investors that were interested. And by this point, they had basically run out of those that they were willing to sell. And so it forced all of this buying to occur on the open market. What actually happened with the price during that quarter? It went up 564%. And here's some evidence that what I'm saying is not just made up, but it's actually true. If you look here, this is from BidInfo charts. This is the percentage of Dash that was in the top 100 addresses. And you can see a spike here of about 5% of the circulating supply that went up in the period of 2 days. That was Evan consolidating all of those inputs into a common set of addresses. And that included around 140 masternodes that he was managing for family, church members, family friends, acquaintances. And you can see that those actually got spun back out into masternodes. If you really look at the blockchain, you can see spun back out into those 140 masternodes. According to him, he allocated those, gave them their own hardware devices, and stopped managing them on their behalf. And so if you net that out, it's about the 265,000 that Evan said that he had at the last open house. And if you look at the price during this time, you can see that things really started to accelerate in January and February. If you look at the number of masternodes that were in operation on each date in history, it appears like a large chunk of them were shut down in early January, and another large chunk were shut down in early February. This seemed to create a bit of rocket fuel for the price, and I'll explain why. But that's not the only change that was occurring here. As you allocate more of the reward towards masternodes, there's a lot less pressure to sell. And so if you look here at the economics of a miner, a lot of that cost goes towards electricity, hardware, maybe labor or real estate, rack costs, things like that. And you get some portion that is profit. Masternodes, on the other hand, have very low costs. You might spend $10 a month on hosting or something of that nature, but most of that ends up being profit for the operator. And what that means is, as you shift the allocation from miners towards masternodes, it's actually shutting off supply to the market, because not all masternodes sell their rewards. Some of them do, but many of them were accumulating, or they were using some of that to spin up new masternodes. It wasn't necessarily entering circulating supply. And the nature of collateralized nodes themselves create some instability. Why? Well, if you're a buyer and you have a desired allocation of, say, 800 dash, you're pretty incentivized by this system to go out and acquire 200 more. Why? Because you're going to start generating masternode rewards if you can meet the 1,000 dash requirement. And so this encouraged buyers to buy more than they actually wanted to buy. And I saw this behavior personally. I saw it with friends of mine that were sitting at 700 dash and trying to figure out how they could get that last 300. So we know this type of behavior occurred. And on the seller side, masternodes discourage selling when the price goes high. Even when the price reached over $1,000, and people were literally millionaires, they didn't diversify. Why? Because if they sold even 100 dash, that masternode income would go away. And so at most, especially for people who only operated a single masternode, there was absolutely no desire to sell anything more than the rewards. So while masternode collateral is absolutely required for our system to operate, there's very good reasons to have it. It introduces these dynamics that other networks just don't have to deal with. ASICs also introduced a new dynamic. Before ASICs, it was GPU and CPU mining at home. And you didn't see the discrete electricity that you were paying for that in your electric bill. Oftentimes people would just retain that. They weren't forced sellers. But when ASIC economics come in and you start operating mining as a business, all of a sudden you start to enter a world of very, very high competition. Under a stable price environment, miners make very little profit. Most of their funds go towards equipment. The second largest chunk is electricity. And then they've got other expenses, networking expenses, server expenses, and so on. And so the revenue allocation, as they get revenue, is very much allocated towards costs. And some of it is available for profit. But when the price of Dash starts accelerating very quickly, there simply isn't enough time for new equipment to be manufactured, shipped to the miners, and put into operation. When our price is going up 100% over the course of 3 days, what ends up happening is, in this example, a 5% profit margin turns into 52.5% if the price doubles overnight. And that's essentially what was happening. Well, what effect does that have? Well, if I'm a miner and I don't actually have to sell all of my Dash in order to pay my operating expenses, it gives me a new option. Instead of selling my Dash, I can actually retain my earnings in Dash. And so at precisely the time when the market is demanding Dash the most, miner supply can actually drop. Well, what does that do to price? It exacerbates it even more. And by the way, this is not unique to Dash. This is true of all proof-of-work mining chains. But it is a contributor that when price is going up, these economics play into the supply that's available to the market, and it exacerbates long-term price moves. So combine all of this stuff. What did we have in 2017? We had a euphoric cycle. We had people, fear of missing out buying, up to a threshold that they had to meet in order to acquire a masternode, if that was acquirable for them, which led to a higher price, higher miner profit, and when miner profit is high, the supply slows down to the market. That in turn contributes to a higher price, and the momentum continues. We really had this runaway effect in 2017. And here's basically how it all played out. Dash really was at the forefront of the 2017 altcoin bull run. In Q1, we moved from 7th place up to 3rd place on CoinMarketCap ranking. And from that point on, our ranking did start to slip. And by the end of the year, we were down to 9th place. Even though our price was going up pretty dramatically. It just so happened that Dash went through this cycle at precisely the same time that the market did as a whole. And those things combined really set a fire underneath the price. But it's interesting here that we started off the year with a bang and then slowly slid through the rest of 2017. Not in absolute terms, but relative to the market. And I think the reason was that the economics of our system started to turn the other way at that point in time. And I'll get into the details on that in a minute. Circulating supply inflation started to increase. We've had annual reward reductions, and that means lower ROI for the masternodes. That, of course, can lead to lower demand. Lower pricing tends to increase the ROI demanded by masternode operators because the project is viewed as more high risk. So as the momentum moves the other way or we underperform the rest of the market, that confidence starts to slip and the ROI demanded by masternodes goes up. When ROI demanded by masternodes go up, the number of masternodes naturally goes down. And so this is a bit of a vicious cycle. Kind of the opposite of what led us to the 2017 bull run in the first place. So let's look at circulating supply and what happened. Here's the quarterly inflation rate in the circulating supply. And what you can see here is that prior to mid-2017, circulating supply was pretty tight. There were quarters that it was up a bit. There were quarters it was down a bit, but it was pretty tight. And then if you take in, Q1 of 2017 was pretty flat. But if you take into account the 265,000 Dash that was taken offline from the masternode system, and didn't really enter circulating supply, we took about 10% of the circulating supply out in a single quarter. And that is going to have a dramatic effect on price. What happened starting in mid-2017? Well, the circulating supply portion started to increase at a pretty rapid rate. The number of masternodes being created slowed down, and the number of coins being entered into the market kind of remained flat. And so if you calculate these numbers out on a quarterly basis, we were inflating the supply at over 20% per year. And by Q1 of 2019, if you did the 12 prior months, it had reached 27% plus. Increasing supply at 27% a year is going to have an effect, especially when competing coins are emitting at a much lower rate. Now, the last couple quarters, the effect seems to be dissipating, but I don't think that's likely to continue. That came from a surge in the number of masternodes. It may be that the declining price is allowing masternode ownership to reach a wider audience as opposed to increasing demand for masternodes. And in fact, if you look at this quarter, we're down about 150 masternodes from the peak. So there's been a huge amount of reversal of this trend. And so let's project it forward. If you look at the projections of capital flows, there are some assumptions that you could make that are reasonable. One is that the number of masternodes stabilizes from here. It's been growing, and let's say that it stabilizes, right? In that case, the circulating supply would increase at about a 13% rate. So it would not be nearly as bad as what we've experienced over the last 18 months or so, but it would continue at a fairly high rate. If you believe that the declining block rewards would cause the exit of masternodes from the system, then you may have a situation where we start to see a decline in the number of masternodes. If you assume this scenario, the number would be closer to 18%. And so the situation isn't likely to go away on its own if we do nothing. But the good news is that there are things that we can do. I would point out as well that the likely real number here is much higher in both scenarios. Why? Well, there's around 130,000 Dash that is still in addresses that have been completely dormant since January of 2014. They've never had a deposit. They've never had a withdrawal. They've never had any type of activity to those addresses at all. Likely those coins, a high percentage of those coins are lost. There's another 200,000 or so that have been in addresses that are completely dormant for 5 years. And so likely the base here of actually circulating coins is smaller than depicted on this graph. And therefore, the inflation rates that this projects are actually much higher. Hopefully that concept makes sense. So if you look at the rest of the market and look at other similarly purposed coins, their annualized money supply growth is lower. And there are reasons for this. One is Dash is a younger coin than Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, or Litecoin. And so it's had less time for the base to build and for the emission schedule to drop. Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash emit at about 3.6% per year. That is scheduled to drop further next year to about half that, and so below 2%. Litecoin just went through a halvening event, and they're sitting at 4.1, so they'll be there for a while. The US dollar M2 money supply, this includes like savings accounts and things like that, that increases long-term about 6%. Right now, I think it's about 7.4% over the last 12 months. But long-term, money supply increases about 6%. Dash, across all Dash in existence, it increases at about 7.5% per year. And this is kind of the headline number everybody looks at. Not many people have looked at this aspect of it. And if circulating supply is really the number that matters, then I would argue that it's really tough for Dash to compete as a store of value compared to these other alternatives. And the reason is because if we're inflating supply that much, on days when the market is up, we may be up just a little bit less on average. And on days when the market is down, we're going to be down just a little bit more on average. And that tends to compound in our psyche, collective psyche, to say, hey, look, Dash has been moving down the rankings. It's likely to continue to do that. I don't want to be a part of that. And so I think that these effects show up very subtly, but over time they compound and they create a real issue for the store of value properties of the coin. ASIC proof of mining economics have also changed in this environment. When the price is declining, instead of a stable environment where you end up with a small profit for miners, you of course have the opposite problem. Now, in this example, if the price drops in half in a rapid period of time, a 5% profit margin turns into losses. And a higher share of the miner reward has to pay for electricity. You've got other fixed costs associated with labor or other costs that the operator has. And it becomes the case that they can't even get their money back on their equipment. I've talked with miners. I sympathize with them. They bought their equipment at the end of 2017 when Bitmain came out with their latest line, and they expected to get a certain return. And the price of Dash has fallen. Many of them have equipment that they've never opened. I've heard stories of pallets of hardware sitting in unopened boxes that they're unwilling to turn on because they won't even pay for the electricity, let alone get their equipment costs back. I think we're in a situation where proof of work mining, even if the price were to double, more of that equipment would come online, the hash rate would go up, but profitability wouldn't change. I don't think there's a situation or a scenario in which mining really becomes profitable by the time that equipment becomes obsolete. And the effect is that miners actually have to sell out of inventory to keep operating. We see this with Bitcoin right now. We've heard news stories about miners that are actually dipping into their Bitcoin reserves in order to pay for their operating expenses on a temporary basis until price improves. And so here's the effect. When the price goes down, miners increase the supply to the market, making the situation worse. And so you see the exactly opposite of what we talked about earlier on the supply side. So proof of work mining has this destabilizing effect. Again, this has nothing to do with Dash specifically. This is true of any proof of work chain. They have naturally price destabilizing economics to them. And so I think that we're in this disillusionment cycle. I think we all feel it. There's been a loss of confidence. That leads to a lower price, greater miner losses, higher supply to the market, lower price, and that momentum continues. That's a really tough cycle to break. When you break it, it tends to swing wildly the other way. And so all of these attributes combine to have long-term boom and bust cycle type of economics. It's worth going back and asking, well, why was Dash proof of work anyway? If it has these types of attributes. Well, really proof of work was the only option at the time. There were a couple of experimental proof of stake chains. They weren't proven to be secure, certainly. The main reason that Evan invented a new mining algorithm, X11, was to allow for distribution of the coin. By making it CPU and GPU hardware mineable for at least 2 years, that was his goal, it would allow people to acquire Dash using their home computers without permission and go out and participate in the network. And so this was pre-ICO. This was pre any other method of allocating out. And he didn't want to use, say, SHA-256 because by that point that was already an industrialized solution. It wouldn't give people exposure to his coin. So that was the main reason for X11. I had a conversation with Evan in early 2015 and presented the fact that the majority of coins are actually becoming proof of stake. If you looked at the top 10, most of them were proof of stake, and it was becoming certainly more acceptable. He evaluated it and put it to the side, mainly because of the InstantX feature. That InstantX is, which is Instant Send today, was dependent on a high randomness in the hashes that you can only get with proof of work. And so proof of stake would allow a user to manipulate those hashes, basically hold back blocks that they found in favor of better ones that would allow them to select the masternodes that would validate a transaction, as an example. And so it was really a big risk for our system in particular, and that was the reason why it wasn't really evaluated further. But it does have major drawbacks. It is expensive and wasteful in terms of electricity and equipment. We do spend about $307,000 annually on miners. The miners have to liquidate all of their revenue on the market. And so it is not a profitable enterprise for them. And so I think it's also hard to argue at this point that ASIC proof of work mining is a big acquisition strategy for us today. How many of you run a mining farm? There's one. And this is a group of cryptocurrency enthusiasts, right? And so we're certainly not out signing up the newbies that have never experienced this stuff before. So that benefit is now gone. And of course, there are environmentalists who care about this stuff and decide that cryptocurrency isn't for me because it's wasteful. As we've discussed, it creates volatility. There's a security issue with it. And that is, over time, it rewards operators that are operating with the lowest cost electricity and the largest scale operations. It's centralizing over long periods of time. Right now, there are just two pools that control 62% of our hash rate. And this is not unique to Dash. There are other proof of work coins where centralization is becoming an issue. And so it isn't providing the kind of distributed security that it was supposed to. And lastly, there's some misaligned incentives here. Miners don't always have the same incentives as our users that we care about. Fees are a perfect example of this. Miners would love to see a constrained system like Bitcoin where they can extract high fees because the users have to compete over that space. That isn't necessarily what's best for our users or our coin's growth. And so incentives are not always misaligned, but there are certainly risks that there are misalignments. One of the things that we've heard about for years is, hey, why don't you introduce masternode shares? Masternode shares would allow anyone to participate in the rewards system. And that would be viewed as an important driver for adoption. We've heard this from teams that operate with Dash and you know, in conversations with people, the ability to generate new coins is attractive. And so why don't we roll this out to everyone? And I would argue that increasing masternode collateral is a temporary fix to this issue. It doesn't actually solve the fundamental dynamics of our economics. It doesn't make us more stable. I also wonder if smaller ownership shares would likely provide less incentive to participate in our governance system or give it the proper attention that it needs to cast proper votes. There's a lot of time that masternode owners spend evaluating proposals and voting on them. And so I think that it solves some of the problems. It doesn't solve all of the problems or the root cause of the problems. And I do question whether it would really increase demand for Dash at all. If the number of masternodes rise as a consequence of introducing masternode shares, ROI of operating a masternode actually drops, of course, because each masternode would get paid less frequently. And as a result, I hypothesize that a good number of masternodes would choose to leave the system. The ROI drop below their required threshold. And so I don't think that necessarily this is an answer that would stabilize the economics. I've also heard the question, why not just increase masternode rewards? Just keep allocating more towards masternodes and it will encourage the creation of more masternodes. Well, one thing is we don't actually need more masternodes at this point. We have a large number of them. It doesn't actually address the shortcomings of these economics that we've discussed. What it does is it kicks the can down the road. We now know through history that increasing the allocation to masternodes results in an unsustainable price increase. The supply changes are highly sensitive. This is like trying to drive a truck backwards with a trailer on it. It's very sensitive, and if you get it wrong, it can swing wildly in the wrong direction. And if you do it, you better go slow. But there's another issue. There's a limit to that strategy. You can't keep allocating more and more and more and have no miners left and no more that you can allocate towards masternodes. This is a temporary solution. And I would argue that knowing what we know now about how all of these dynamics work together, and we have enough evidence to back those things up, it'd be pretty unethical to go out and do this because we know what kind of effect it might have. Very irresponsible to go out and do something like this, in my opinion. What matters is decreasing that net dilution that our users are experiencing. And what do I mean by net dilution? Well, here I'm talking about a masternode as an example. Masternodes experience the supply growth just like any other participant in the network. But they generate rewards that accumulate at a rate of about 6.2%. They have some small operating costs associated with them, but net, they're diluted very slowly as a percentage of the total coin market cap that they own. That rewards that they receive largely offset the dilution that they experience. And so year after year, a masternode owner will own less and less of the network, but certainly at a much lower rate than the 18% that we talked about that our general users are experiencing. So I hypothesize that the right answer here is that to the extent that we can reduce and or eliminate the miner expense associated with our network and pass those savings to users, not masternodes, have the most effect on stabilizing our price. And it would address a lot of the shortcomings that we've walked through so far. We would eliminate that $307,000 in expenses that are currently going to miners. This is money that is going straight out the door outside of our network to electric companies, to equipment manufacturers, and our miners aren't even making money. Small Dash investors would receive block rewards, and that would offset the dilution. Not only would the expense go away, but they would be the recipient of the savings. And so it would have double the effect that it would have allocating it anywhere else. As a result, rewards wouldn't be dumped on the market. If you look at the behavior differences between a miner, which is forced to sell, and a user who just watches them accumulate in their wallet, they're not necessarily going out there and selling all of their rewards with the same veracity. And so selling pressure on the market would decline if we were to eliminate this expense. And that would have a positive impact on our budget too, because without all of that selling pressure, all else being equal, the price would be higher. And since our budget is denominated in Dash, a higher price allows us to do more as a network. By the way, if we were to completely eliminate miners, and I'm not saying that's the answer, we'll go into what some of our options are, but if you were able to do that, there are fewer coins circulating than there are in masternodes right now. And if you allocated that towards users, you would actually have a higher ROI for the sake of simplicity. I'll call it staking. That is one technology, but we'll get into, again, the options. It would actually be more profitable. And so if you're less interested in voting or dealing with the technical aspects of operating a masternode, the logical thing would be to shut down your masternode and go stake your coins. And so I believe that we'd see a number of masternodes that would shift to staking. Well, so what's the benefit to masternodes of this? Masternodes, if there are fewer of them, would be paid more frequently. They would participate in the cost savings here as well. And so it would become more attractive for the masternodes. And so here's another benefit. The number of masternodes would stabilize in a very predictable manner. Right now, we don't know what's going to happen with the future. With block rewards going down, usage going up, maybe fees are enough to offset that. But we simply don't know what is likely to occur. In this model, people have the ability to switch between staking and masternode ownership. And you would therefore expect that the ROI of the two would roughly equalize over time. That means that the share of coins that would be in masternodes at any one point in time would be far more predictable. And if that is the case, we'll have a more stable amount of coins that are locked away in masternodes. And so it has a lot of benefits that would provide stability for our users. And let me be clear, the product that we are selling to our users or providing to the market isn't just a great payment mechanism. There's a coin you have to use on it, and it's called Dash. And if Dash isn't a great coin, it doesn't matter how great our payment network is. If it's an unstable price and has these naturally tendencies to swing wildly one direction or another, that's not a very good system for payments. And so we have to have both. We have to be both a great store of value and we have to be a great payment mechanism. So as I said, eliminating those costs and passing them to our users have other benefits. Vote quality would be maintained. If you're less interested in voting, you would exit the masternode layer of the network in favor of something more profitable. Proof of work contribution to price volatility would be eliminated, those effects that we talked about. There's the potential for better security. This is going to be up to debate because there's different models out there. There's a lot of legitimate criticisms of proof of stake. The primary one being that they're susceptible to 51% attacks, but we do have chain locks, and there are perhaps other things we can do to try to address it in a way that other networks haven't. And there's other solutions available to us that continue to rely on proof of work, but perhaps to a less degree. But proof of work mining, in which we have two pools that control the network, is not super great security, in my opinion. And so I think there is a solution out there that actually improves security and provides a lot of these benefits. The block allocation will also become less critical to get perfect. We're always trying to tweak the block rewards, and we're having conversations about, well, how much should we lower miners? And increase this and deal with that from the ivory tower of Dash core group. Well, it doesn't really matter that much in this model because changing that allocation would affect the number of masternodes versus stakers, but it would reach a natural equilibrium. And getting it perfect wouldn't matter to the ROI of either group. It would roughly equalize over a period of time. And the only allocation that would really dilute anyone anymore, since we're collecting our own rewards, is the portion that goes towards the proposal system. And now this becomes the only real decision in the network that has a consequence on the share of the total coins that a particular user or masternode operator ends up with over time. There are many components of a solution that we're looking at, and they can be used in combination with each other. So I want to talk about some of those. None of them are perfect. We don't know what the right answer is. I mostly used proof of stake in my example because it's an example that is the most extreme, eliminates completely proof of work. But there may be issues with it that we're unwilling to live with. And so we're exploring a variety of different methods to secure the network. So proof of stake or proof of service, proof of masternode service. There's very low costs of block production in this model. In the case of proof of stake, it integrates a method to distribute the savings onto users that are staking. Very predictable block times are possible in a scenario in which we have masternodes block producers. By the way, if masternodes are block producers, that doesn't mean that they have to collect the full reward. We can still allocate that out to our users as a cost savings of eliminating some of these other costs. And in that case, very predictable block times are possible. We could produce a block every 2.5 minutes on the nose. We could fully eliminate the proof of work expense in this, but there are security concerns. Chain locks, although very effective at locking in blocks and preventing 51% attacks, are not perfect. They're not perfectly reliable. There are times when the network is undergoing an upgrade, like we are right now, where it's disruptive to them and occasionally they've failed. There are times when a large number of them may be DDoSed, as an example, and they go offline quickly, more quickly than the distributed key generation can develop new quorums. And so they can fail. We've also seen them fail during stress tests. We've made some improvements to make them more resilient against that, but they're not perfect. And so we may need backups in case chain locks fail in order to keep the network secure. We don't know exactly what those look like. They could be light versions of chain locks. And this is going to be resource intensive if we decide to pursue something like this. There's also a potential proof of stake concentration risk. Binance is offering free staking, no fees, and they're, as a result, accumulating huge portions of some of these proof of stake networks and effectively control them. That may be a security concern. And so we certainly don't want to replicate that. One advantage we have is that we have a lot of big exchanges. And so it may be less of a concern for us than a lot of these smaller proof of stake coins, but it's nonetheless something that we would have to solve for. Masternode shares. These are easy to implement. They require almost no changes to our system and could be done fairly quickly. But they don't really do very much to improve the root causes of this. And without a reallocation from proof of work towards this, it could have, it wouldn't actually have any effect on regular users for the most part. Our economic structure remains the same, and it could, this is delicate business. That could cause a mini price bubble or even a burst. And it's easy for people to understand why there would be a price bubble. Perhaps a bunch of people would go buy Dash hoping to start up a masternode. What about a masternode owner who only has one masternode that doesn't really want to have that much in Dash? Could actually see people shutting down their masternodes to start an even smaller portion with a share. And we simply don't know what would happen if we did masternode shares. And so this option is risky. It carries risks. Deterministic holders list. This is a good way, perhaps, to distribute the savings associated with proof of work. If we were to use, for example, proof of masternode service as a block creation mechanism, you could have people register their address through a process similar to the deterministic masternode list, where it registers your address on-chain as eligible for payments. There are issues with this. It would require some minimum. I don't know what that minimum is, but if you don't have a minimum, there's a large number of addresses that could end up in that list, and it could become a system issue in terms of the amount of memory and the amount of CPU consumption it would take to operate that list. And so because of those constraints, you would have to set some type of address limit of a minimum of, say, 100 Dash. So this wouldn't benefit everyone. It would benefit far more people, and it would help offset the economics, but it wouldn't be able to reach everyone. It wouldn't be completely fair. As far as the entropy source, so the randomness that I talked about earlier, chain locks are a really great source of entropy. So we have an alternative to proof of work that may actually be better. Why? Well, chain locks are completely unpredictable. The hashes associated with chain locks are completely unpredictable. And they're completely unpredictable to everyone who participates in their creation, including the final participant. They're deterministic in nature, and they're easily proven. And so they're really tough to manipulate. I would say impossible. I can't think of a way. And I see Dr. Darren Tapp nodding his head here in the front row. The issue is that BLS signatures can fail. The chain locks can fail. So we would need some type of backup in place in order to provide adequate entropy. Again, we don't want it to be manipulatable, what the quorums are and how the system selects validators and things. And so if we retain proof of work, that could be a backup source, although we might spend less on proof of work than we spend today. And so we're looking at these options. We're looking at these options in combination with each other. We're still generating new ideas. But the goal is, if we can reduce the amount that we're spending on proof of work and allocate that not towards masternodes, but towards our users, it will stabilize our economics to the greatest degree possible. I put together this illustration of the most extreme example of this occurring, which would be proof of stake. In proof of stake, absolutely anyone can stake their coins, and proof of work goes away completely. So this is the most extreme example of eliminating proof of work expense and fully allocating that out towards any user. If you assume that 130,000 Dash that's been in addresses that are dormant since January of 2014 are likely lost, I think the real number is much higher. As you can see, 312,000 addresses that haven't had activity in at least 10 years, or 5 years. If we assume that at least 10% of the remaining circulating coins will be used in commerce, sitting in my wallet or something else, I think that's an extremely conservative assumption. Sitting on an exchange, etc. That means that there's at most 3.6 million coins that are available for staking today. And if you took that 307,000 block production that we have per year and allocate that towards 3.6 million, you'll quickly come up with the number. 8.5% ROI for staking your coins. And this is the absolute worst case scenario based on these assumptions. That's higher than the 6.2% earned for masternode operations. In that environment, many masternodes would shift to staking because the rewards would be more attractive. And if you blend the two and figure out where the two would equalize, it's at 7.2%. Now again, that is the bare minimum. That assumes that these things are right over here on the left. It's likely that more coins have been lost or would not be used for staking. They'd be used in commerce. They'd be held up in transactions. They'd be in our dash drive system as money flowing around within credits. And here's what the results would be. Today, masternodes, as I illustrated earlier, are diluted in terms of the share of the coins that they control at a rate of about 1.5% per year. That would drop to 0.8 due to the higher returns that they would get from this reallocation. Users would benefit the most. Instead of being diluted at 18.3%, going forward, they would also experience about 0.8%. Again, this is a combination of eliminating the expense and directing the benefit towards them. And the blended total across our entire system would go from 7.5 to 0.8% per year. That 0.8 can't really go away. That's the proposal system. But we benefit from that. We benefit from growth of new services on our network, from business development team, from the developers who create new features that we all benefit from the acquisition of new users. And so that is a very valuable 0.8% that all of us should be willing to live with. And so net, the economics of this system dramatically improve for our users. We have some constraints in terms of what the solution is that we're looking for. And we're looking for the community's input as to which of these they would be willing to support. We want to do this in a transparent and collaborative way. We want to be getting input from technical experts in our community, the technical team within Dash Core Group, from economists, from people that have opinions on this, and just from our users as to what they'd like to see happen. If proof of work is retained, though, we have to remain the dominant X11 chain. It's very important to be the dominant chain of your proof of work algorithm. Lucky for us, the next chain down that uses X11 is pretty small. And so I don't think it would take much to retain our throne as king of X11. The solution must remain secure and resilient if the masternode network fails. If there's a denial of service attack or a rapid change in the masternodes, or if there's a new version that comes out and there's a period of time in which the two versions don't collaborate well with each other, which can happen during more extreme changes that we might introduce, it needs to remain secure. So it has to function without chain locks or instant. Now, proof of stake on its own can do this, but there are risks to it. And so can we improve upon those risks using BLS signatures or some other mechanism? We have to provide the rewards to regular users to offset the inflation rate that they're experiencing. That's really important. And we should target better economics than our competitors. I think that there's no reason we can't come up with a solution, given the theoretical limits of this that I just showed you with proof of stake, that would outperform Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, Litecoin, and any other coin out there in terms of their inflation rates, even after Bitcoin undergoes its halvening event next year. We still have 2% there to work with. And so I think that we can come up with a solution that will target better economics. So here are some of the objections that I've heard and my personal response to those. Why can't we just take most of the 45% from miners and just give it to masternodes? Well, we've covered this. This would cause likely a large price appreciation and crash that would be unsustainable. And I think if we did it at this point in time, it would be really unethical. It wouldn't really substantially change ROI, by the way. I think it would ultimately create more masternodes. Masternode ROI would drop, and so on. Isn't proof of stake less secure? Well, the main objection is that it's susceptible to 51% attacks. I think we've proven that if we there are technical solutions to this problem. We've largely solved it with chain locks. I bet if you had a chain locks backup and some other solutions in place, this is technically solvable. It is possible to make proof of stake more secure. And there is more than one mechanism with chain locks and instant send and so on to be able to extend that, perhaps. Can we just change the allocation? Isn't 45-45-10 sacred? Well, as we've shown, we've changed it tons of times. It was supposed to change even more before the proposal system was set. And largely that 10% was arbitrary based on where we were in that cycle when he happened to finish the proposal system. And so why are we scared to change something that has changed so often? Is it fair to the miners? Well, we're facing an existential threat. If you don't fix this over a long period of time, we're going to lose the confidence of our users. And it would take a long time for those effects to go away on their own. As I showed you, it does eventually dissipate, but it's many years into the future. And alternatives have much lower inflation than us. And so we need to fix it. Miners have already lost 97% of their anticipated income. Maybe not 97. That assumes that they bought their equipment in mid-December. But my point is that when this equipment was sold in Q4 of 2017, and that's the last major sale of equipment that we've seen, they've lost around 92, 93% of the anticipated income that they would have received. And so I don't think there's much we can do at this point. I certainly sympathize, but even if the price doubles from here, or triples from here, or quadruples from here, the number of those pieces of equipment that get turned on might go up, but profitability isn't going to change. The fundamental issue isn't going to go away for them. And so this isn't something I can solve. This isn't a group I can help. But I can help our users. And I think if this really is an issue and we feel like as a community that we have a contractual obligation or a non-contractual obligation to allow them to continue to mine for a period of time, there can be a transition period. Even having a plan in place, knowing that this effect is going to go away, would have a positive impact on people's confidence in us. And so there is a way to satisfy all groups, I think, and provide a way for some type of transition period to take place. We may also end up with hybrid proof of work, proof of stake, or some other solution that would allow proof of work to continue to play a role within our coin. And as the price then recovers due to the improvements that we've made to our economics, I would anticipate that they would benefit then from that. So this isn't, I think we all have the desire to try to fix this. There are just very limited number of tools that we have to work with to fix this problem. And ultimately, we can't. We can't. So who loses in this? Somebody must be losing, right? Well, I'd say the electric utilities are the primary losers. I don't think miner equipment manufacturers were likely to sell much more X11 mining equipment, but maybe they would lose out on some future potential revenue. I view miner equipment manufacturers as vendors to our vendors. They supply equipment to miners who supply hash rate to our network. And so I'm not super concerned about Bitmain's fortunes. And to a lesser extent, hosting providers, if there's a smaller number of masternodes, for example, that shut down, then maybe we'd see a loss of some of revenue to hosting providers. But masternode owners are better off, as we've shown. Our users are way better off. They should be much happier to use Dash without these types of issues in the network. And so the people that we have an obligation to, I think, are the ones that benefit the most. I also have a beef with our proposal system. If we're doing this, we might as well do a little bit more. And so as I said, kind of the 10% was this compromise. We've all witnessed the problems with a fixed 10% that goes towards the treasury system. During late 2017 and early 2018, what did we see? When the price was skyrocketing, proposal system was going largely unused at one point because the available funding was going up faster than teams could spin up to service the network. And then we started seeing a lot of really low value activity come in. With the mentality of it's better to spend it than waste it, right? That was the term that I heard thrown around a lot. We can't waste our budget. Let's just start throwing money around. We were sponsoring MMA fighters, TV shows, ads on airplanes, all kinds of stuff. And I would argue as a masternode owner, I didn't feel like a lot of that was a good use of funds. I'd rather capture that for the network, for our users, for our masternode operators, rather than see it go outside of our network. And in late 2018 and through this year, when prices are low, Dash Core Group is struggling. We've got people working for free, volunteering. We're having to lay off entire teams. Those may not be in the best interest of our network. As a masternode owner, speaking as a masternode owner, I want right now to allocate more than 10% towards the proposal system. And it's not because I'm paid minimum wage. I don't care. What I care about is the future of the network. And so I talk with masternode owners. Most of them feel the same way. So why are we in this rigid system? Why is it that a person, Dash Core Group, set this back in 2015? We haven't adjusted it. It doesn't make any sense. It should be flexible. And it shouldn't be set by me or any of the developers in Dash Core Group. It should be set by the network. And it should flex with what the network needs. And so I'm proposing that we make it flexible. And if you enable the masternode to determine the allocation each month, you've got masternodes whose interests are tightly aligned with the interests of users. We want to grow the network utilization, the value of Dash, and we should share equally in those costs. So if a masternode is willing to allocate and vote 12% towards the proposal system, it would simply be 12, 44, 44 that month. If the price is high and there aren't a lot of great teams that are coming forward with requests for those fundings, they can lower it to 6% and allocate 6%, 47%, 47%. Gone is the issue of, quote, waste. And they should only be willing to invest to the extent that it can be put to good use, not being spent on MMA fighters. Sorry to whoever put that proposal up. I don't mean to harp on it. So how could this work? I think there's a lot of different ways it could work. There's pros and cons. Here's some of them that I've heard. One is a slow adjustment. Simply vote whether to increase it, decrease it, or stay the same in 1% increments each month. This would allow it to flex over a long period of time, but give predictability as to roughly what it will be in future periods. The cons is it would take a long time to make major changes, and there are some scenarios in which masternodes might gain the outcome. If I want it to go up, I might nonetheless vote to stay the same if going up isn't likely to win. And so we're all gaming each other in order to get something better. In other words, you're not incentivized necessarily to vote for your best option. You might be voting for your second best. And that might compromise the outcome. There's also a system that allows for rapid adjustment. We simply vote on a monthly basis with a number, and we take the median, not the mean. The mean is manipulatable. I should vote 0 or 100% to try to swing the number as far to my preferred number as possible. But in the median, you're always incentivized to vote for the number you actually want. Because any other number runs the risk of pulling the median away from the number of that you want. And I've consulted with voting system experts on this, and this is what a lot of them are recommending. The only real downside to it is that it's less predictable for the masternode and block producer rewards. I think that may be an issue that we're willing to live with, because I don't think it would actually change rapidly over time. I don't think you're going to see a sudden change in how all the masternodes are voting at once. There's pros with these. They allow the masternode network to signal what share they're willing to allocate. In other words, they can set an upper limit. And that can help prevent abuse. If Dash Core Group in the future starts, taking fancy cars to the airport and flying first class everywhere and putting proposals up and the choice is yes or no, that might not be a good thing. But if you put a limit on it and say all the teams have to compete within this amount, it puts more pressure on the teams to deliver value. There's another one that Eugen proposed here. I'll give full credit to him, is automatic adjustment. Any proposal that passes more than 10% net votes should be rewarded, and the rest allocated out 50-50 between the masternode. There is an issue with this. You may have some excess spending if people start to abuse it. By the way, you could combine these two. Yes, but I'm referring to like Dash Core Group or some other important entity putting up a larger proposal than they would like to fund. They're then forced to binarily approve it or not approve it. By setting the limit, they can avoid that situation, or at least signal that they're not willing to spend a lot. And so you can combine these two so that there isn't waste. You can set a limit and allow for automatic adjustment. And so we're going to be exploring these options and coming up with solutions that allow the proposal system to be flexible. I also think more rational fees could help. We have currently the median fee is 1/50th of a penny. Users don't actually care that it's 1/50th of a penny or 1/40th of a penny or 1/30th of a penny. The only thing I ever hear is it's less than a penny. This fee doesn't cover the cost of the data storage on the masternode network. It actually leaches off the masternodes in terms of value. And so I believe that we need to reset. I mean, we last set this in January of 2018 near the peak. Fees of even a penny would generate $75 extra a day towards masternode rewards. And that would offset some of the effects of this 7% decline that we see every year. It would start to generate actually measurable amounts of income to the system. So I do think that this is a very minor thing, but it at least reduces some of the misalignment of incentives here. Right now, our network is very vulnerable to spam type of attacks and things because the cost has just become so low to be able to initiate these transactions. Next steps. We want this, as I said, to be very interactive with the community. This is not something where we're going to come out with a set of changes and ask you to upgrade. These are profound changes to the economics of the system, and they need to be thoroughly discussed. We want input from the community. We want to do it in a transparent way. We want to have lots of discussions and debates internally with experts and with our community to see what they can support. We're going to develop a proposal for a long-term solution, maybe even more than one. We're going to look at temporary measures. Are there pieces of these economic changes that we can implement more quickly than others? Well, if there's value there, we should go and chunk that out as a separate piece of work. So we'll submit decision proposals to the network regarding any of the following things. We're not going to change the reward allocation. We're not going to change the proposal system. We're not going to change the fees. And we're not going to change block production alterations in terms of making proof of stake block production or masternode proof of service production without consent of the network. And in the end, we're going to end up with a system that has lower net inflation to our users, lower net inflation to the masternode operators, lower operating costs. All of that electrical expense, not all of it, but we're aiming to eliminate as much of it as we can safely. And more flexible proposal funding to allow the network to invest at times when it needs to invest and, be more frugal when, the price is allowing for much more to be done. And so I think that this set of changes in combination will make Dash more resilient in the market. They'll make the price more buoyant in the market and less likely to swing one direction or the other. It'll have buoyancy towards a more natural number. It will give us the ability to put resources to work when we need to. And ultimately will be a better store of value. And I think that if you make Dash a better store of value with the incredible adoption we're getting from our payments capabilities, those two are going to turbocharge each other. I really think that the transaction growth we're seeing tells us how good of a payment system we have. The one hang-up people have is what's happening with the value of Dash. And that's addressable. We can do that. We can fix that issue. And so if you provide a much more stable currency on the network that we've built that has incredible attributes, I think Dash is going to really get its swagger back. And that's the goal here. So, that concludes my presentation on store of value. There's going to be a ton of questions. I know that we've run over on time. I started late and I probably ended even later. This was scheduled to conclude at 5 o'clock. We may have time for a couple of questions-ish. One or two? Okay, we'll take one or two questions, and then I will be engaging lots of people over the next 2 weeks probably in various forums. We'll hold some Ask Me Anythings. We'll do a bunch of things to try to get some initial engagement and response. I don't know how this will be received, and I'm sure we're already getting lots of responses. But and then we'll continue the conversation probably at a bar down the street or something for those that are here in person. And so with that, I'll stop and we'll take one or two questions depending on how much time we can devote.
I'm just going to say it's a comment, but another thing to consider is the network's made this great payment thing, and there's this weird economic thing that's called monetary velocity about how often the money changes hands. And so, like, I have a Dash, give it to Steve, give it to Dave, and that, like, if we give it, 4 or 5 times, it's like that one Dash is like a supply of 5 instead of if I just had it and kept it and whatever. So there's this concept of monetary velocity. So I support, making the best payment network in the world and getting a lot of users and getting a lot of payments and increasing that monetary velocity is just a consequence of that, of success. But if we study the monetary policy, I went and got the economics books and started reading them, and the monetary policy says when the monetary velocity increases, the actual value of your currency decreases for that same reason it acts as more supply. So that's something else that I think is congruent with your presentation, but just something else I think we should consider. We're a victim of our own success.
I mean, a new user that is using Dash is greater than someone who's yeah.
A new user using Dash that would boost what the economists call aggregate demand, and that aggregate demand is what's going to make the price go up.
Yeah. So both are effects. Do we have time for one more or no? One more? All right. Hand shoot up.
So quickly, the differences on shared masternode and staking, when you're actually staking the coins, would you actually be still adding to the consensus of the network? And also, I guess a little bit more about how staking would work. And also, do you see a chance of decreasing the collateral amount to be a masternode?
All right, so a few different questions there.
Yeah, sorry, that was a lot.
Hold on to that if you want. So first question was on staking, and staking or proof of stake is a consensus mechanism in and of itself. So it would be the block production and consensus algorithm that would essentially underpin the network. The masternodes would remain validators of that, so they would continue issuing chain locks. There's a bunch of different versions of proof of stake. We haven't, gone into the detail of exactly which one would work best. There are some where coins are burned as a transaction fee. There are some where coins are allocated on a percentage basis, so you get a fixed percent for staking your coins. And then there's some that are more market-based, where there is a block reward, and the more coins you have, the more likely you are to find that next block. And there are various mechanisms. There's pros and cons with each. But that's how proof of stake works, and that's the effect on consensus. As far as masternode shares go, masternode shares, as I said, may or may not be beneficial to the network. We simply don't know. We could try to guess by polling masternode owners in order to figure out what they would do if masternode shares were available. If a lot of them would shut down and run half of one, might not be all that could be fairly catastrophic. So I would be hesitant to do something like that without data backing up the fact that it would be beneficial. But again, it doesn't fundamentally change any of these economics for our users. It might allow a very small fraction of our users to become partial masternode owners, say 100 Dash masternode share threshold or something like that. But I don't think it would fundamentally change what we're looking at here in the problem we're trying to solve. And then the last one was on what, I'm sorry?
The collateral, and
yeah.
that would decrease.
So reducing the collateral, say, to 500 or 100, the effect that would have is it would, in the event of 500, it would roughly double the number of masternodes on the network. The ROI demanded would be the same. And so you would expect that there'd be around 500 or about double the number of masternodes. Because your collateral would drop by half, but the number of masternodes would double. And so you'd end up with the same ROI for operating masternodes. It just might become a little more accessible to people.
Yeah, I was just thinking with future price increase to allow masternodes for more diverse individuals.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of the demand for that, this is my hypothesis, I don't know this to be true, but a lot of the demand for masternode ownership is simply because of I rarely hear people say, well, I want to be able to vote. They're primarily focused on, when it comes to shares or very small portions, they want to participate in the rewards. And so that's why I'm focused on allocating rewards to our users rather than messing with an already, kind of sensitive masternode network. We've largely leveled out at this point. Making further changes is risky behavior. And so I'm trying to avoid that risk and come up with a solution that has predictable outcomes. Okay. We're going to have to wrap up. We have to be out of the room in less than 5 minutes. So apologies for going over. Hope you enjoyed it.
Everyone, we do